Good day. Next book, our second book in a book study. Our first one was Tuesdays with Maury, which we ended on this past Tuesday. Today's Thursday, February 23rd, 2023. So it's 2/23/23. Very good book. Did we ever figure out why, or did we talk about why you think that this title was with a small t and Maury's name was with a large M? Well, easy to know why it's a large M on someone's name, right? Tuesday, I'm just guessing, I'm positing a possible answer to why the author decided to not capitalize Tuesday, but to capitalize Maury. Because Maury, again, this is just my assumption. I don't know this for sure, but I'm assuming that he used this writing technique to show that Maury was much more important than everyday common things like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We have tons and tons of these in our lives, but we have very few. Well, hopefully not. Unless if you're blessed, then you have a lot of these special people in your life. So, just a food for thought. I was thinking about that on my walk this morning, thinking that we never really discussed that or came to a conclusion around that. So, our next book is The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. Now, remember, when we do a book study, we want to look at the book actually and see what's what. Now, I only have one copy of this version of this book, the full color collector's edition. I have all seven in a smaller version of this, but this caught my eye one day when I was at the bookstore. And why? Because it has all these colored pictures. And who doesn't love colored pictures, right? I want to give a shout out to the person that illustrated these by Pauline Baines. So even look at this. Look at this first picture here. Isn't that kind of cute? Here's the actual room that they were in, where they were transported. Okay, so who is C.S. Lewis? So research that. Who is he? What did he stand for? Who was he contemporaries with? That means what time period was he writing in? Who were his friends? You'll find it very interesting that the author of The Lord of the Rings these guys were friends. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were friends, and they would get together once a week or so, maybe more, for tea and conversation with another group, a couple other gentlemen, English gentlemen. The reason I know this is because one of my professors when I was in college, Thomas Howard, was a student of C.S. Lewis way back when. And I had taken a course on C.S. Lewis's writing, the Space Trilogy and Chronicles of Narnia, when I was in college. So it was he and the professor. He was quite animated. So reading these aloud with him were so much fun. So that's why I chose this book to read again. And notice, most people, this is The Magician's Nephew. And if you can notice, it is number one in the series. But when you hear of C.S. Lewis and you hear of Chronicles of Narnia, people think about the, now it's slipping my mind. Oh, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. They think of that instead of The Magician's Nephew. And I'm trying to think if all of the movies that have been made, the animated movies, not the animated, but you know what I'm talking about, if they ever did one of the first. I know they did Dawn Treader, They did The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Prince Caspian, they did him. I think I might have those. I have a few of those movies, but I don't know if they ever did The Magician's Nephew. So let's get on with it. Let's look at this. So right away in the beginning of the book, the secret passage to the house next door leads to a brand new world. Narnia, where horses sometimes grow wings and talking beasts are called to life. A new world full of magic where the adventures begin. Diggory and Polly meet and become friends one cold, wet summer in London. Their lives burst into adventure when Uncle Andrew, who thinks he is a magician, sends them hurtling to somewhere else. They find their way to a new land, Narnia. But when they awaken an evil sorceress, Polly and Diggory are sent on a quest to stop her before she destroys the world they've just discovered. Interesting. So if we look at the rest of the book here, we see that this is the order in which the books are meant to be read. I don't know if they were actually the order in which they were written. I would have to do more research on C.S. Lewis. Interesting thing. Who is C.S. Lewis? Again, we're getting back to this question of who is the author. Some people think he's a philosopher, he's a theologian, he's a mystic writer. Why is he writing children's books? Another interesting question. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote those folklore, right? Sometimes when we think about the unexplainable, words aren't enough. Well, that's because they're unexplainable. Some certain events in the world. So, the best way to talk about them is in allegory, or in metaphors. He was as big as a horse, or he was as big as an elephant. His pride was as big as an elephant. So, what do we think is being communicated? What messages are being communicated in C.S. Lewis? So, as I read this book, I'll probably stop every so often for a little commentary. So, I apologize if you're reading along. And this is broken up into chapters. See, the first one is The Wrong Door. So, this will be a little bit easier to track than our last book because it wasn't really broken into numbered chapters, even though that's what we did at the beginning. The end of chapter 15 is the end of this story and the beginning of all the others. And how many pages is this? Well, the last chapter begins at 193. 193? Geez, this is a long book. Interesting. So this must be a bookmark that I made when I read this actual copy a while back. I have a 8-ball on here because I like billiards. I have a 3-leaf clover because my name's Patrick, right? And I like books. So there's a picture of a book on here. So you can make your own. This could be a fun thing to do at the beginning of reading this book. And then you'll have a story to remember of when, and a physical remembrance of when you first read the book. Or you read it through this time with somebody else. Let's get on with it. I'm going to take a little bit of a drink. Cheers. No, there's no alcohol in this. It's just coffee. See, I can see coffee and milk. I will stop and show you the pictures as well. Okay. Chapter 1, The Wrong Door. This is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It is a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. In those days, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was still living in Baker Street, and the Bastables were looking for treasure in the Lewisham Road. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day, and schools were usually nastier than now. But meals were nicer, and as far as sweets, oof, I can't tell you how cheap and good they were, because it would only make your mouth water in vain. So we won't go there. I added that part. And in those days, there lived in London a girl called Polly Plummer. Plummer, not to be confused with plumber, the guy that does the plumbing. Let's go on. She lived in one of a long row of houses which were all joined together. Okay, so maybe I'll draw a picture of what those look like. I usually do this if I was in a classroom, and I didn't do it in advance of reading the book, but that were all joined together. One morning, she was out in the back garden when a boy scrambled up from the garden next door and put his face over the wall. Like this. Polly was very surprised because up till now there had never been any children in that house, but only Mr. Ketterley and Miss Ketterley, a brother and sister, old bachelor and old maid, living together. So, just to give you a little aside here, a bachelor and an old maid means that they were never married to each other because they were brother and sister, right? Or anyone else. So they're single. So she looked up, full of curiosity. The face of the strange boy was very grubby. It could hardly have been grubbier if he had first rubbed his hands in the earth, and then had a good cry, and then dried his face with his hands. Oh, as a matter of fact, this was very nearly what he had been doing. He was sad. "Hello," said Polly. "Hello," said the boy. "What's your name?" "Polly," said Polly. "What's yours?" "Diggory," said the boy. "I say, what a funny name," said Polly. "It isn't half so funny as Polly," said Diggory. "Yes, it is," said Polly. "No, it isn't," said Diggory. "At any rate, I do wash my face," said Polly, "which is what you need to do, especially after—" And then she stopped. She had been going to say, "after you've been blubbling," but she thought that wouldn't be polite, or it wouldn't be very nice either, huh? "All right, I have then," said Diggory in a much louder voice, like a boy who was so miserable that he didn't care who knew he had been crying. "And so would you," he went on, "if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then been brought to live in this beastly hole like this." "London isn't a beastly hole," said Polly indignantly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and he went on. And if your father was away in India, and you had to come and live with an aunt and an uncle who's mad, who would like that? And if the reason was that they were looking after your mother, and if your mother was ill and was going to die—" Then his face went to the wrong sort of shape, as it does if you're trying to keep back your tears. Oh, I didn't know. I'm sorry, said Polly humbly. And then, because she hardly knew what to say, and also to turn Diggory's mind to cheerful subjects, she asked, Is Mr. Ketterly really mad? Well, um, either he's mad, said Diggory, or there's some other mystery. He has a study on the top floor, and Aunt Letty says I must never go up there. Well, that looks fishy to begin with. And then there's another thing. Whenever he tries to say anything to me at mealtimes, he never even tries to talk to her. She always shuts him up. She says, Don't worry the boy, Andrew. Or, I'm sure Diggory doesn't want to hear about that. Or else, Now, Diggory, wouldn't you like to go out and play in the garden? What sort of things does he try to say? I don't know. He never gets far enough, but there's more than that. One night, it was late in the night, in fact, as I was going past the foot of the attic stairs on my way to bed, and I don't much care for going past them either. I'm sure I heard a yell. Uh, perhaps he keeps a mad wife shut up there. Yes, I've thought of that. Or perhaps he's a coiner. Or he might have been a pirate, like the man at the beginning of Treasure Island, and be always hiding from his old shipmates. How exciting, said Polly. I never knew your house was so interesting. Huh, you may think it interesting, said Diggory, but you wouldn't like it if you had to sleep there. How would you like to lie awake listening for Uncle Andrew's step to come creeping along the passage to your room? He has such awful eyes. That was how Polly and Diggory got to know one another. And as it was just the beginning of the summer holidays, and neither of them was going to the sea that year, they met nearly every day. Their adventures began chiefly because it was one of the wettest and coldest summers there had been for years. That drove them to do indoor things, you might say, indoor exploration. It is wonderful how much exploring you can do with a stump of candle in a big house or in a row of houses. Again, I got to draw a picture of the row houses and how all the roofs, all the attics are kind of connected. But anyhow, so we'll get into that when I draw the picture. Maybe you can research what is a row house. Not to be confused with, like, I try to start reading before the turn of the hour because that happens. So, with the last book, I also talked about this. This chimes one extra than the actual hour. One. Okay, so it chimed 11 times. You notice I had to skip my fingers because I started counting with this one instead of this one. Or, you get it. So if it chimed 11 times and it's actually 1 hour earlier than that, what time is it? Okay, let's get back to the book. That drove them to do indoor things. You might say indoor exploration. It is wonderful how much exploring you can do with a stump of candle in a big house or in a row of houses. Polly had discovered long ago that if you opened a certain little door in the box room attic of her house, you could find the cistern. You can look that word up, Cistern, and a dark place behind it, which you could get into by a little careful climbing. The dark place was like a long tunnel with brick wall on one side and a sloping roof on the other. In the roof, there were little chunks of light between the between the slates. There was no floor in this tunnel. You had to step from rafter to rafter, and between them, there was only plaster. Okay, that's like modern day drywall, just like something that if you stepped on it, you'd fall right through. Actually, um, the plaster was probably stronger than what modern day, because you have to plaster over strips of wooden slats in order for the plaster to stick. So it's interesting how they used to do walls then. You can research it. If you stepped on this, the space between the rafters, you would find yourself falling through the ceiling of the room below. Polly had used the bit of the tunnel just beside the cistern as a smuggler's cave. She had brought up bits of old packing cases and the seats of broken kitchen chairs and, things of that sort, and spread them across from rafter to rafter so as to make a bit of a floor. So it's almost like she was making a bridge that went over all of these different rafters. Here, she kept a cash box containing various treasures and a story she was writing, and usually a few apples. She had often drunk a quiet bottle of ginger beer in there. The old bottles made it look more like a smuggler's cave. Diggory quite liked the cave. She wouldn't let him see the story that she was writing. But he was more interested in exploring. "Look here," he said. "How long does this tunnel go on for? I mean, does it stop where your house ends?" "Oh, no," said Polly. "The walls don't go out to the roof. It goes on. I don't know how far." "Then we could get the length of the whole row of houses." "So we could," said Polly. "And oh, I say!" "What?" "We could get into other houses." "Yes, and get taken up for the burglars." "No thanks." I'm sorry. "Yes, and get taken up for burglars." "No thanks." "Don't be so jolly clever. I was thinking of the house beyond yours." "Well, what about it?" "Why, it's the empty one. Daddy says it's always been empty, ever since we came here." "I suppose we ought to have a look at it then," said Diggory. He was a good deal more excited than you'd have thought from the way he spoke. For of course he was thinking, just as you would have been, of all the reasons why the house might have been empty so long. So there might have been all these mysteries. Someone might have been murdered in there, or it's haunted, or whatever. Let your imagination run wild. Why the house might have been empty so long. So was Polly. Neither of them said the word haunted, and both felt that once the thing had been suggested, it would be feeble not to do it. "Shall we go and try now?" said Diggory. "All right," said Polly. "Don't if you'd rather not," said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," she said. "How are we to know when we're in the next house but one?" "How are we to know when we're in the next house but one?" they decided they would have to go out into the box room and walk across it, taking steps as long as the steps from one rafter to the next. That would give them an idea of how many rafters went to a room. Curious. Then they would allow about 4 more for the passage between the 2 attics in Polly's house, and then the same number for the maid's bedroom as for the box room. That would give them the length of the house. When they had done that distance twice, they would be at the end of Diggory's house. Any door they came to after that would let them into an attic of the empty house. But I don't expect it's really empty at all, said Diggory. Well, what do you expect? Well, I expect somebody lives there, well, in secret, only coming in and out at night with a dark lantern. We shall probably discover a gang of desperate criminals and get a reward. It's all rot to say a house would be empty all those years unless there was some mystery. Daddy thought it must be the drains, said Polly. Pooh! Grown-ups are always thinking of uninteresting explanations, said Diggory. Now that they were talking by daylight in the attic instead of by candlelight in the smuggler's cave, it seemed much less likely that the empty house would be haunted. When they had measured the attic, they had to get a pencil and do a sum. They both got different answers to it at first, and even when they agreed, I am not sure they got it right. They were in a hurry to start on the exploration. We mustn't make a sound, said Polly as they climbed in again behind the cistern. Because it was such an important occasion, they took a candle each. Polly had a good store of these in her cave, her smuggler's cave. It was very dark and dusty and drafty, and they stepped from rafter to rafter without a word except when they whispered to one another, "We're opposite your attic now," or "This must be halfway through our house." And neither of them stumbled, and the candles didn't go out. And at last they came where they could see a little door in the brick wall on their right. There was no bolt or handle on this side of it. There was no bolt or handle on this side of it, of course, for the door had been made for getting in, not for getting out. But there was a catch, as there often is on the inside of a cupboard door, which they felt sure they would be able to turn. "Shall I?" said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," said Polly, just as she had said before. Okay, so here let's look at the picture. So you can see his stiff collar that he has around, and then she's got the fancy dress on. I wonder how she's climbing through an attic in that dress. Both felt that it was becoming very serious, but neither would draw back. Diggory pushed round the catch with some difficulty. The door swung open, and the sudden daylight made them blink. Then, with a great shock, they saw that they were looking not into a deserted attic, but into a furnished room. But it seemed empty enough. It was dead silent. Polly's curiosity got the better of her. She blew out her candle and stepped out into the strange room, making no more noise than a mouse. It was shaped, of course, like an attic, but furnished as a sitting room. Okay, so what do you imagine that they meant? It was shaped like an attic. So maybe the wall, the ceilings kind of came down at a slant, or kind of whatever. And so it's kind of like a little bit cramped, but it looked like a sitting room. So like a living room. Every bit of the walls was lined with shelves, and every bit of the shelves was full of books. Just like behind me, see all these books. A fire was burning in the grate. You remember that it was a very cold, wet summer that year, so that's why there'd be a fire in the fireplace. And in front of the fireplace, with its back toward them, was a high backed armchair. Between the chair and Polly, and filling most of the middle of the room, was a big table piled with all sorts of things, printed books, and books of the sort that you write in, like a composition book. And an ink bottle, and pens, and sealing wax, and a microscope. Remember, this is during the time of Sherlock Holmes, so they're still writing with, with a pen that they have to dip into a little ink well and write. And then when they sealed the envelope, usually they put some wax and you'd put your stamp on it. It would have your family insignia or your initials or something on it. Curious, huh? Cool. Oh, and a microscope. But what she noticed first was a bright red wooden tray with a number of rings on it. Wouldn't you know, a girl would be attracted to rings? But Diggory is too. We'll find out. They were in pairs, a yellow one and a green one together, and another yellow one and another green one. They were no bigger than ordinary rings, and no one could help noticing them because they were so bright. They were the most beautifully shiny little things you can imagine. If Polly had been a very little younger, she would have wanted to put one in her mouth, like a lifesaver or something. The room was so quiet that you noticed the ticking of the clock at once. And yet, as she now found, it was not absolutely quiet either. There was a very, very faint humming sound. If vacuum cleaners had been invented in those days, Polly would have thought it was the sound of a hoover being worked a long way off, several rooms away and several floors below. But it was a nicer sound than that, a more musical tone, only so faint that you could hardly hear it. "It's all right. There's no one here," said Polly over her shoulder to Diggory. She was speaking above a whisper now, and Diggory came out, blinking and looking extremely dirty, as indeed Polly was too. Well, that answered my question earlier. She was crawling around that attic with that fancy schmancy dress on. You know how they have all those lace around the edges? I'm sure that all those have been picking up all these pieces of dust and dirt and grime. "This is no good," he said. "It's not an empty house at all. We'd better leave before anyone comes." "What do you think those are?" said Polly, pointing at the colored rings. "Oh, come on," said Diggory. "The sooner—" He never finished what he was going to say, for at that moment something happened. The high-backed chair in front of the fireplace moved suddenly, and there rose up out of it like a pantomime demon coming up out of a trap door, the alarming form of Uncle Andrew. So imagine, this is a high back chair, a sitting chair. So see how this is a sitting chair here? This is an older chair too, but this one would have been really, really high backed. And so they were back here behind the chair, and they didn't see that someone was sitting on the other side. Okay, because they were back here. This chair, it is a sitting chair, and it's low to the ground. That's why I have all these little cushions on there so that I don't have to sit like I feel like I'm on the ground. So, like a pantomime demon. They were not in the empty house at all. They were in Diggory's house and in the forbidden study. Both children said, "Oh!" and realized their terrible mistake. They felt they ought to have known all along that they hadn't gone nearly far enough. Uncle, Uncle, Uncle Andrew was tall and very thin. He had a long, clean shaven face, unlike mine, with a sharply pointed nose and extremely bright eyes, and a great tousled mop of gray hair. I don't have a great tousle mop. I just got hair that's falling out. Diggory was quite speechless, for Uncle Andrew looked 1,000 times more alarming than he had ever looked before. Polly was not so frightened yet, but she soon was. For the very first thing Uncle Andrew did was to walk across to the door of the room, shut it, and turn the key in the lock. Probably put it in his suit coat pocket so they wouldn't be able to get the key. He would keep the key. That would be scary. Then he turned around, fixed the children with his bright eyes. He's not fixing them like they were broken or something. He fixed his eyes. He focused his eyes on them and smiled, showing all his teeth. Oh, just as an aside, British people are known not for the greatest dentistry, and so he's writing this in such a way to hint at Uncle Andrew's teeth probably aren't the best looking, but he's got a sinister smile too, so it only adds to it. His teeth are like, ugh. "There," he said. "Now my fool of a sister can't get at you." It was dreadfully unlike anything a grown-up would be expected to do. Polly's heart came into her mouth. Usually we'd say into her throat, but she was so scared it went into her mouth. And she and Diggory started backing toward the little door they had come in by. Uncle Andrew was too quick for them. He got behind them and shut that door too, and stood in front of it. Then he rubbed his hands and made his knuckles crack. Mine don't crack like that. He had very long, beautifully white fingers. "I am delighted to see you," he said. "Two children are just what I wanted." Please, Mr. Ketterly," said Polly. "It's nearly my dinner time, and I've got to go home. Will you let us out, please?" "Not just yet," said Uncle Andrew. "This is too good an opportunity to miss. I wanted two children. You see, I'm in the middle of a great experiment. I've tried it on a guinea pig, and it seemed to work. But then a guinea pig can't tell you anything, and you can't explain to it how to come back." "Look here, Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. "It really is dinner time, and they'll be looking for us in a moment. You must let us out." "Must?" said Uncle Andrew. Diggory and Polly glanced at one another. They dared not say anything, but the glances meant, "Isn't this dreadful?" and "We must honor him." "If you let us go for our dinner now," said Polly. "We could come back after dinner." "Ha ha ha! But how do I know that you would?" said Uncle Andrew with a cunning smile. Something like that. Then he seemed to change his mind. "Well, well," he said, "if you really must go, I suppose you must. I can't expect two youngsters like you to find it much fun talking to an old buffer like me." He sighed and went on. "You've no idea how lonely I sometimes am. But no matter. Go to your dinner. But I must give you a present before you go. It's not every day that I see a little girl in my dingy old study, especially, if I may say so, such a very attractive young lady as yourself." Polly began to think he might not really be mad after all. Meaning he's not so bad of a guy. He's saying some nice things, right? Be careful. "Wouldn't you like a ring, my dear?" said Uncle Andrew to Polly. "Do you mean one of those yellow or green ones?" said Polly. "How lovely!" Not a green one," said Uncle Andrew. "I'm afraid I can't give the green ones away. But I'd be delighted to give you any of the yellow ones, with my love. Come and try one on." Polly had now quite got over her fright, and felt sure that the old gentleman was not mad. And there was certainly something strangely attractive about those bright rings. She moved over to the tray. "Why, I declare," she said, "that that humming noise gets louder here. It's almost as if the rings were making it." "What a funny fancy, my dear," said Uncle Andrew with a laugh. It sounded a very natural laugh, but Diggory had seen an eager, almost a greedy look on his face. "Polly, don't be a fool!" he shouted. "Don't touch them!" It was too late. Exactly as he spoke, Polly's hand went out to touch one of the rings, and immediately, without a flash or a noise or a warning of any sort, there was no Polly. Diggory and his uncle were alone in the room. That's where I'm going to stop for today, because I see that we're at minute 43, and that's kind of long into one reading. So you'll have to come back for chapter 2, and I'm not sure how we're going to break up this book, but we'll do that at the beginning of the next reading. So hopefully you have bitten the forbidden fruit, so to speak, that now you're interested in knowing more and more about what's going to be going on in this book. And I will see you soon. Be better, do better. See you soon.